there, and welcome back to The Bible is Clear, except when it isn't. Does the Genesis creation account contradict theories like the Big Bang? For years, creationists and evolutionists have been at odds with each other about how to teach world history. A famous case took place in July of 1925 when Tennessee high school teacher John T. Scopes was accused of violating the Butler Act, a Tennessee state law that outlawed the teaching of evolution in public schools. This case, which is now famously referred to as the Scopes Monkey Trial, was popularized in the 1955 play Inherit the Wind. Even to this day, 100 years later, there are fundamentalist Christians who teach young earth creationism. Perhaps most famously, the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky is built around a literal reading of Genesis 1 and 2. It was founded by Ken Ham, an Australian Christian fundamentalist who insists the Bible must be read literally. As such, the 6,000-year age of the earth must also be true. This includes, by the way, the Genesis story of the flood and Noah's Ark. The flood narrative is found in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Pause the video and read those chapters if you'd like. Because of his belief in the factual nature of the flood narrative, Ham built the Ark Encounter as a Christian theme park in Williamstown, Kentucky. The centerpiece of the park is a model of Noah's Ark as described in the Genesis story. So did the flood really happen? Again, scientific consensus tells us that no, it did not happen in the way it's described in Genesis. However, that does not mean that there was no flood. There have been many floods in recorded human history, and in fact, we've even had devastating floods in the United States just within the past year. But why do we have floods? Because we have weather. Rain brings water. Water rushes downward. Rain in the mountains means possible flooding in the lowlands. But what could the flood narrative really be about? Potentially, it's simply making sense of an otherwise seemingly senseless event. Did God flood the world because humanity was bad? No. There simply isn't enough water on earth for there to have been a catastrophic flood that covered the entire landmass of the earth. It's just not possible. But did it rain for a very long time? And did that abundance of rain likely bring flooding and maybe even devastating flooding? It's certainly possible. And if you lived in a valley surrounded by mountains and that valley flooded, then as far as you could tell, your entire world was flooded. And did this flood kill lots of people? Perhaps. And did it destroy lots of things? Perhaps. But was there a boat full of animals? Not likely. There are many myths about floods in recorded human history. People want to make sense out of things that don't make sense. Our brains don't like not knowing specifics, so we fill in the blanks, and the authors of Genesis filled in the blanks to make a story that teaches us of the covenant of God and God's promise to never annihilate humanity. That's a good and necessary message for us to hear. The fact that there was no ark is not really crucial to the story. The story teaches us a larger truth. It's not intended to be a newspaper account. And that's the danger we can fall into if we read the scriptures literally. Our minds are 21st century minds, and we have access to books and magazines and television and radio and the internet. You're watching this video using technology that didn't exist even 20 years ago. We're bombarded with information at a rate faster than any other time in human history. And that paints the way that we interpret literature. And that's what Genesis is, literature. It isn't telling us that these events happen the exact way that they're described. It's telling us a story so that we can develop a deeper understanding of the underlying message. And that's where the exegesis comes in. It's our job to discover the deeper message. And to do that, we must understand context. What was happening in the world when the text was written? What part of the world was it written in? What was the political climate like? What was the weather like? What was the environment like? What was influencing the narrative? What literary tools might have been common in those days, and what do similar writings teach us? We might not be able to discover the answers to all of these questions, but we might be able to figure out at least some of them. And when we get new information, it's imperative that we don't deny ourselves the ability to adjust our understandings. Like the example from earlier, just about anyone who has read the Bible can at least quote Genesis 1:1 in the beginning. But now that we know that in the beginning is not an accurate translation of what was being communicated, it's our work to be willing to make the adjustment and to shift the narrative. When God began to create might not sound quite as poetic, but it's more accurate, and it can shift the narrative. For fundamentalists and biblical literalists, it makes it virtually impossible to wrestle with because their theology is based around the beginning. But if we look at when God began to create, there's a suggestion for more possibilities. It also opens up the possibility that we might look at creation not as a one-time event, but as an ongoing process. If you've ever had the privilege of watching a volcanic eruption, then you've witnessed creation happening in real time. If you've ever watched the birth of a child, then you've witnessed creation happening in real time. Being flexible with our theology and our biblical literacy can help us to have a deeper, more meaningful theological understanding, and it keeps us from limiting ourselves and from keeping God trapped inside a box.